So in the previous video, we looked at how to sign and verify tokens in our authentication flow. In this video, we'll take a look at how a front-end application interacts with the backend using this same JSON web token. And I'll use this command to create this React project. I'll just open this up in a different VS Code window, and inside our server project, I'll simply run the server and keep it open. Now we'll take a look at the React application. Inside app.js, we'll remove everything from here. Before moving forward, we first need to install a few things inside this application. The first package that we need is the React router. React router helps us to navigate inside a project to different routes, so we need that. And the second package that we need is Axios. Axios is a better version of the fetch API that comes out of the box, so we'll use Axios instead. Okay, so once this is done, we'll quickly add a few things to our project. The first thing that we need over here is a few routes. So I first need to import browser router from React router DOM. I don't need this, so I'll remove this logo. We are also not using any styles in our application, so I'll remove this as well. Inside this browser router, we'll create a couple of routes. Now, since I'm using React Router 6, you might see a few differences in the implementation as compared to the previous versions. You can check out their documentation because it's pretty straightforward and it's not that difficult to understand. So we need to create two components first. I'll just add them over here, and this will be self-closing. So we have these two routes. I need to import them first. So now we need to create these two components. I'll create a components folder inside here. And I'll create these two pages. I'll try to keep this as simple as possible. So inside this login component, we need two fields. The first field will be an input field for our username. And the second field will be for the password. We need to create state elements for this username and password. So I'll use useState hook for this. And I also need to add a button over here. The value here needs to be username, and for this I'll pass in password. And since I get access to an event object inside onChange, I can use it to populate my username and password values. And the value will be inside event.target.value. I'll do the same thing for password, but instead I'll use set password. Now we need to create the submit method over here, so I'll just add a submit method. For the time being, I'll just console log the username and password. So temporarily our login file looks done. We'll move on to the protected file. This will be very straightforward. I'll just add protected over here. We'll add a few extra things to this later, but for now we'll just keep it as it is. We are still getting an error inside here, so we first need to import these two components. So once this is done, we can test out our application by typing npm start, and it will open up our application on port 3000. Now since we are using React Router version 6, we need to put in our route elements inside this routes container. So now once this is done, this should work. Yeah. So we have this form over here. We actually didn't really add a text inside our button, so we'll do that. I'll just keep it as submit. Okay, so we have this. I'll just open up the console. Now if I enter a username, let's say John, and password 1234, I'll get these values in the console, which is exactly what we were doing. And we also have the protected route. That also is working. Now we can go to our actual implementation. So the ideal flow is, whenever I submit a form from my front-end application, I need to trigger the API that I had created inside my backend application for the login route. So if I go to my backend application, I'll find this login endpoint. So inside this login endpoint, when I pass in valid credentials, I'll get this back. So once I get this back, I'll just store this token inside my local storage. So whenever I try to make any subsequent requests after I've logged in, I need to use this token that is stored inside the local storage. So we'll then try to make a request to this protected route, and if we get a valid response, only then we'll redirect the user to the protected route, else the protected route will be inaccessible. So we need a valid token to access this route. So what we'll do is, we'll come back to this React application and use Axios to make a post request. We first need to import Axios, so it's right here, and we have this post method here. So inside this post method, we need to pass in a few things. The first thing is the URL, obviously. So the URL that we have in our application is localhost, the port is 5000, and the endpoint is login. The second one is data, and in data we need to pass in our username and password. So I'll just pass in the username and password as an object over here, and yeah, and that's pretty much it. So once we trigger this request, this returns a promise, so we can use, and inside this promise we get this user object. We can also catch this and have an error over here. I'll just log the error and also the user. So I'll save this and try this out in our application. I'll just enter a random string to see if the error works. I get this message saying I'm unauthorized because these are not valid credentials. Now I'll replace this with a valid user, and since we had already created John in our previous videos, I'll enter John's credentials and I'll submit. So I get this data object in return. Now inside this data object, I have this data key, and this data key, if you open up, we can see that we have this message, logged in successfully, we have a success key, and we have this token. So this data object is basically the same object that we were returning in our backend application, this object. So we can use this object now. We get this token key inside this response, so we can use this token and store it in our local storage. So I'll just set a local storage item. This will be user.data.token because this is our user object inside which we have this data object, and inside this data object we have this token key. So once this submit method executes successfully, we store our token inside the local storage. Now I'll save this and go back to our application. Now I'll go to the application tab and open up the local storage. You can see that we don't have any keys here. I'll still clear it again. We don't really have anything. If I submit now, you'll see that we have this new key here, token, and this bearer, this whole thing over here. So we have this stored inside our token key. Now whenever a user tries to go to this protected route, we need to validate this token that we have stored inside the local storage, and based on its validity, only then we need to redirect the user to the protected route. So inside our application, inside the protected route, we'll first add a use effect, and this use effect will run only once. So I'll pass in an empty array as the second argument. Now inside this use effect, I need to check if the token is valid or not. So whenever I enter this protected route, at the very beginning this use effect will run, and inside this use effect I need to put in logic that will basically check if the token is valid or not, and if it is valid, only then let the user access this protected route. If it's not valid, then we need to redirect the user back to the login page. So what we'll do is we'll first fetch the token from the local storage. So let's put it inside a variable. So once we have this token, if we go to our Express app, we can see that we have this GET request for this protected route. Inside this we use this passport authenticate middleware, and if you had watched the previous video, the way this route worked was we used to pass in the token inside an authorization header. So we'll do the same in our React application. I'll come back to this. I'll use Axios again, and this time it will be a GET request. The URL will be the same, and the endpoint will be protected. Now inside this GET request, we can also pass in a few options. So since we need to pass in headers, I can just add this headers object, and inside our headers object we were passing in an authorization header. So I need to add this over here, and this authorization header will take this token value, so I'll pass in the token here. So this will work. Now since this returns a promise, I can add a callback. I'll just console log the response for now. And we can also catch errors. So I'll again just console log this for now. If I go to my application and I open up the console, I'll just go to my local storage first and clear everything. And since I don't have anything here, I can simply go to the protected route directly. Now if you see here, we are getting an error 401, because whenever I try to make a request to this endpoint, it will check if I have a token or not. And since if you see I don't have anything inside my local storage, I get a 401 error. So now since we know that we are getting an error inside this block, we can do something inside this block. So if I get an error inside this use effect, I can redirect the user back to the login page. So this means that if the user is not authenticated, he cannot access this route. And in order to redirect a user from one point to another, I'll make use of React Router. So in React Router 6, there's a new hook called use navigate. So we'll use that to redirect the user. So I can just create a variable, and inside this navigate function I need to pass in the relative path. In our case, the user needs to be redirected to login if there's an error, so we'll just add login over here. Now if I save this and go back to my application and clear this console, again I'll show you that there's no token inside the local storage. So if I try to access the protected route now, I should be redirected back to the login route because I don't have anything here. So now if I change this to protected, you must have seen something here. So what happened? We went to the protected route. Inside the protected route, this use effect got triggered, and And inside this use effect, we actually got an error. And since we got an error, we basically navigate the user back to this login route. So that is what happened. If you take a look at the console, you'll see that we tried to access this protected route. We tried to make a request to our protected route. I'll try this once again. I'll go to the protected route. The request happens. And then since we get this error, we redirect the user back to the login page. Now if I instead actually add valid credentials 1 2 3 4 and I submit, now I do have a token inside my local storage. So if I go to my local storage, I can see that I have this token over here. So now if I try to access the protected route, I'll be able to do it. I don't get an error because inside this use effect, this catch block never really gets triggered. So I'm inside this success block and I'm just console logging the response. So you can also see the response here, line number 14, which is this. This is the response that I'm getting. We can actually do something like this inside our login file as well. So basically whenever we are inside this block, we can actually redirect the user to the protected route. So I'll use the same use navigate hook inside this component. So let navigate. Yeah. So now if I try to log in, I'll just go back and I'll clear my local storage. So if I try to go to protected, I ideally should be redirected back to the login page. Yes, so this is working. Now if I enter valid credentials, John and 1 2 3 4, I'll be redirected to the protected route. So this also works. We can add one more thing to our application. So if at all we have a token inside our local storage and we go to our login route, ideally what should happen is we should be directly redirected to our protected route because we already have a token, so we need not authenticate again and again. So we'll do that for our application. I'll just copy this use effect from the protected route and paste it inside our login route. I need to import use effect first, so use effect. And inside this, most of the logic will be the same. I'm passing the token. Yeah, everything's the same. The only thing that we need to add inside here is if I get a valid response, that basically means that my token is valid. So I'll just redirect the user to the protected route. Yeah, so this is it. Now if I go to my application, so now I already have a token over here. So ideally I should not be putting in my credentials again because I already am authenticated. If I go to my login route, I'll automatically be redirected to my protected route. So this is also working. If I clear this now and I go back to my login route, I won't be redirected to this protected route. So login. Now it's working fine. So if I enter John 1 2 3 4 and I submit, I'm inside my protected route. If I go back to login, I'm redirected to my protected route just because I have a token, which means that I'm authenticated. So that's pretty much the end of this series. We have looked at multiple authentication strategies like session-based authentication and token-based authentication. We first took a look at the passport's local strategy, which was the typical username and password authentication strategy. We then took a look at OAuth authentication methods, for which we made use of Passport's Google OAuth 2.0 strategy. If you want to implement any other OAuth authentication methods, most of the business logic inside the application will be the same. The only thing that will be different is how you procure the user credentials. So the developer console for each OAuth provider will be different. So in case of Twitter or in case of Facebook, the way you get access to your credentials will be slightly different, but the overall implementation inside Passport for those OAuth strategies will pretty much be the same. And then we finally looked at the JWT strategy. And at the end, we made this React application which communicated with the backend using this token that we had created inside our JWT strategy backend application. If you have any doubts, ideas or suggestions, you can put them in the comments below. The GitHub repository for all these projects is in the description, so you can access them over there. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I'll see you in the next one.